Mazica, Chapter 1. Written by Jeff Douglas for the Myths and Legacy Project. Narrated by Lahari, founder, Red Star Games. In the darkness of Spherus Magna's now moonless night, Pterodax's eyes gleamed for a fraction of a second before igniting. Twin beams of heat vision blazed towards a piece of scrap metal he had found in the former sands of Barra Magna. As the Makuta welded his armor shut, Mazica prodded a small slug with a stick. It was a rather bizarre creature, and a disgusting one at that. The gelatinous creature was unlike anything he had ever seen, as it lacked any sort of mechanical component, and it was difficult to understand how it didn't just dissolve into a puddle. It was only the assurance of Makuta, as well as the fact that Mazica had visited Spherus Magna before, that prevented him from thinking he had shifted dimensions again. So, the Toa once again proved themselves capable of melding this planet back together, Pterodax mused. The only difference is that the Matoran here are the Toa of my world. A handful of Toa, Mazica murmured. Against scores of enemies they should have killed long ago.
Indeed.
Mazica frowned, staring into the flames. And now we have lost our universe.
It seems you have.
Mazica sighed. Months had passed since the day that he and Voltrez had been whisked away to another dimension, and during that time, so much had changed. Mazica had found help in the form of an alternate Makuta Pterodax who had never gone rogue, but he quickly realized that it might not be enough. During his absence, his own universe's Makuta had usurped Matanui as Great Spirit, spreading his shadow across the Matoran universe and reigning supreme over even nature itself. Then, mere days after he and his friends had returned, Makuta had been defeated, and the entire universe was left in ruins. Now they were refugees on an alien planet, alone and abandoned. Even the Order of Matanui was scattered far and wide, and by what Mazica had come to understand, Helrix herself had vanished. Those few Toa still alive were working to bridge the cultural divide between Spherus Magna's old residents and the new. But fresh threats were quickly rising to take Makuta's place. It's a wonder there are any Toa left, Mazica added. Only 1,000 years ago, there were several hundred. Tens of thousands of years ago, there were a few thousand. Now, less than 50. Makuta said nothing. So many Matoran viewed the Toa as beings like deities, the sons and daughters of Matanui himself, living embodiments of the elements. But I never really understood that. And few Matoran south of Metru Nui did either. The Trencrom Peninsula rarely saw any Toa. Only time they paid us any attention was when the region was caught up in a big war 15,000 years ago. And even then, they only stayed long enough to clean up their own mess. They've just gone out and died, leaving us Matoran to fend for ourselves.
The Toa here have failed you.
What? Mazica asked, startled. He hadn't quite expected Makuta to share his sentiment. He actually expected to argue the point.
You are a Matoran. You are that which the Toa are sworn to protect. When your universe fell into ruins because the Toa did not possess the metal to do what was necessary. That is why my counterpart and those like him won. He did not lose sight of the ends of his plan. The Toa, in their naivete, failed to recognize what they had to do to win. Their complacency fostered their own downfall.
Yes. The Order, at least, was willing to take more practical measures if they had to. Makuta magnetically pulled the last of the softened metal together. He glanced up at Mazica, then at some of the lights in the village in the distance.
My armor is as good as it is going to get under these circumstances. Let us rest tonight and tomorrow head for Bota Magna. If we find threats to peace before we reach the great beings of this world, we will eliminate them as we go. Locating the great beings is, however, paramount.
Threats to peace.
Mazika.
The Matoran roused, then looked up at the pearl-white armored Makuta. What?
Have you taken a life before?
Sure. I leave people to die all the time.
That is not what I asked.
For a moment, Mazika was taken aback, and he snorted. Who do you think you're talking to? I was in the Order for Matanui's sake. We didn't impose the same rudimentary restrictions on ourselves that the Toa love so much. Makuta said nothing for a while. And as the flickering light danced across his lustrous armor, Mazika's indignance dissipated. He was transfixed by the sight.
The time is approaching where we will be forced to take lives if we are to restore order and justice to this world. When that time comes, I cannot afford any hesitation on your part. Understood?
Of course. But let's not forget that I chose you for this very purpose.
Perhaps you chose me because I could do the things that you could not. Be the things you could not.
Mazika squinted. In the darkness, he couldn't tell if the soft-speaking Makuta was joking or not. I never failed the Order, the Matoran said slowly. I will not fail you. I am trained to be merciless.
Then tell me of your first kill.
Mazika stared absently into the flames, his mind's eye returning to a day 4 years ago, when the vacuum of darkness was as oppressive as it is tonight. Mazika's own dagger poised over the fallen form of a Brotherhood spy, the voice of a Day Matoran pleading with him to stop. Mazika's unforgiving wrath pushed him to the precipice.
Let me hear the story of the very first time that you took a life.
Mazika lowered his eyes and began to tell his tale. It was a Shadow Matoran 4 years ago. I had only just been recruited into the Order of Matanui, around the time Voltraz attacked the village of Day Matoran on the Tren Krum Peninsula. It was my hope that I could hunt him down then and there, before he escaped the continent. But my quarry proved elusive. Legacy Weapons, Chapter 1. Written by Bob the Doctor 27 for the Myths and Legacy Project. Narrated by Lahari, founder RSG. Pokes, the Toahaga of Stone, concentrated deeply to call upon his elemental powers to raise the great megalith of rock before him. With a mighty heave, the stone slab shifted, allowing the proto-cairn trapped beneath it to wriggle its way free. Vocalizing a weak screech, the Rahi charged past the Toa, its tail slamming into his waist and knocking him aside.
No need to thank me,
wheezed the Toa, watching as the creature headed for the south, following the scent of the Rahi that had been liberated before it. It had been a lengthy endeavor to work his way this far into the ruins of the Matoran universe with his teammates, freeing the remaining survivors trapped by the collapse of the Great Spirit robot. Together, the survivors were cooperating to recover trapped settlements of Matoran and Rahi, many of whom were pinned beneath debris like the Proto-Cairn, or huddled around dying heat sources while the world crumbled around them. Bamunga, along with many of the surviving Toa of Earth, had remained behind on the southern continent, where they were working tirelessly to unearth the Matoran who had taken shelter in the Nui Caves. Similarly, Gaki had joined with her Toa of Water sisters to transport the universe's aquatic Rahi to the oceans of Spherus Magna. Chuckling at his own fortune, Pokes straightened his back and gazed out triumphantly at the valley around him. A proud city belonging to the followers of the Baraki Prydak had once stood here, now dilapidated and overgrown with vegetation in his absence. Many exotic breeds of Rahi had settled here, alongside a thriving village of Famatorn in the east. While Aruni and Kulis had spent the morning occupied by the island's Maturi population, Pokes and Norik had concerned themselves with the villagers. Now, all four Toahaga had reconvened for one final sweep of the island before moving on to the northern isles. "I'm surprised the Toamari haven't pitched in," mused Aruni, using a Ratuka spinner to heal a Husi that was hobbling a wounded leg. "Could have used Kongu's help herding those fader bulls." Pokes exchanged an uncertain glance with Kulis, whose torn features showed up even on his own mask of Rahi control. "I'm sure they have a good reason for their absence," suggested the Toe of Ice, turning to face the horizon, which seemed locked in a state of perpetual sunrise. Pogue snorted.
"Or a bad one."
In a place far removed from the grasslands of the Matoran universe, Jala, leader of the Toamari, watched the rising pillars of stone and earth that slowly grew out of the seabed. He gazed impassively as they knotted together, rising up through the ocean depths to meet the surface an inch at a time. The castle these pillars now surrounded was ornate and beautiful, and the golden-skinned being had seen fit to assign the Toa the responsibility of reinforcing the foundations. Itching at the back of his mind, the Toa of Fire could sense the influence of another presiding over his thoughts, as though a vicious cloud were numbing his mind and pushing him out. It was a sensation he had felt before while under the hypnotic influence of the Baraki Takadox, though the force that commanded his limbs now left him wholeheartedly committed to the cause. There was no inkling of resistance now, rather the dignity of humble servitude to the first true leader he had ever known. Under his command, the Toamari gave their elemental energies gladly in a watery expanse where no other Toa dared to journey, and carved a place for the Skakti to finally reside on this strange new world. They worked tirelessly, their labors consumed entirely by the construction of this underwater platform, manipulating the untouched depths of Aqua Magna to extend the foundations of a fortress. Beside him, Nuparu and Huki were hard at work channeling their respective elemental powers of earth and stone, while Holly summoned water currents carrying sediment. Jala supposed it was only fitting that the Toa should work so vigorously to develop the foundations of such a structure. After all, the last time that they had united their powers, they had brought down the Cord, destroying the lost city whose name they honored, Mari Nui. Of course, back then, they had counted an extra Toa amongst their number, a loss Jala doubted the team would ever truly heal from. Perhaps this was their penance for their failure, an opportunity to make right the destruction that they had wrought, a way to recognize their fallen comrade. With Matoro among them, they might have honored their new leader with a tower of glistening ice upon which to build his kingdom. Spurred on by the tremendous guilt in his chest, the Toa of Fire nodded to Kongu, who wordlessly swung his arms around and opened another air corridor between his teammates and the newly formed patch of rock. Launching a burst of fire through the oxygen-rich tunnel from the tip of his power blade, Jaller welded shut a fissure in the stonework, a growing fault revealed to him by his Kinohi Arthron. There could be no imperfections. Observing from the shoreline of Aqua Magna, the gold-skinned being to whom the Toamari owed their allegiance smiled warmly. Flanked by legions of his followers, he remarked how vastly his numbers had grown. For some time he had come to contemplate the nature of his genesis. Born of the fused psyches of a Vortex, a Steltian, a Ziglak, and the 6 renegade Piraka, he had emerged from the annals of ancient myth as the salvation of the Skakti species, a conquering titan capable of withstanding the fearsome Makuta, even taking the likeness of their most barbaric champion, Irnak. Finding a universe in turbulent disarray, he had united the remaining tribes of Zakaz under his banner, and now, with the downfall of Nektan, his army had grown tenfold. With Matanui once more absent from this fledgling world, and with a team of Toa under his command, he was uniquely positioned to conquer. Casting a cursory glance over the droves of warriors assembled at his side, he sensed an irrefutable desire for justice and upward mobility amongst his followers. They were bruisers and laborers, all too often dismissed or overlooked for their more violent tendencies. Their passion ran deep, and yet they had proven to be blunt and predictable, like most of the Skakti he had encountered over the course of his 9 lives. Puffing his armored chest out and stepping forward, one of the Skakti generals moved to address him.
My liege, these Toa Mari,
He began cautiously.
are not to be underestimated. My clan has heard tales of their exploits on Voyanui and in the depths of the pit. They may champion the will of Matanui, and they are unlike any before them. We must tread lightly where they are concerned.
I consider it a wise policy never to underestimate Toa.
Countered the gold-skinned being, his voice conveying a wisdom as old and inflexible as the aeons. Hardened by the War of Zakaz, the tribesmen each bristled with a silent fury, with only the prospect of his leadership keeping them from unleashing their fury on one another. He had seen their deepest desires, even given form to a number of the more diverse cravings, and he still remained unfulfilled by the terseness of the Skakti imagination. Ambition was clearly a sentiment felt by all the component species of his genetic makeup, yet such appetites were not his to yearn for. The Skakti had venerated him as a veritable messiah, a conquering titan capable of withstanding the fearsome Makuta. In actuality, he had no such aspirations, for the Golden Colossus could already feel his interest in their cause waning.
For now, the Toa add credibility to our endeavor,
He announced to the warlord who had approached him.
but I take your counsel under advisement, General. Once their usefulness has expired, so too shall they.
A satisfied murmur resounded amongst the assembled Skakti. Already, the blind concurrence of his followers was growing more tiresome. The golden-skinned being continued to gaze out with interest at the Toa Mari riding the waves, constructing the plateau upon which he would build his fortress. The Toa had been given limited instruction, and yet they had already completed their task, engaging in the Matoran pastime of construction and servitude as eagerly as Pakawi flocked to the shore. Unlike the Skakti forces he had been surrounded by of late, he could practically taste the remorse emanating from the Toa. He even found himself wondering what manner of cravings Matanui's chosen guardians indulged in when tested as they had been. Deep within his amalgamated psyche, Akan smiled a toothy grin at the notion. Light on the Dunes, a vision of the Great Being's Prelude Chapter 1. Written and narrated by Sigma, lore director for Red Star Games.
As the sun rose high over Spherus Magna's sands, Takanuva couldn't shake the feeling that something was wrong. It had only been a few days since the Makuta's defeat, when he had joined the Matoran in celebrating their newfound freedom from tyranny. Yet somehow, that relief and jubilation was dimmer now, as if it was over a decade old. When Tahu had sent him to watch over a caravan of Gamatoran on their way to fetch water from an oasis, he had leapt at the opportunity to clear his mind. The Gamatoran were nice enough. They had evacuated from a small island in the eastern chain, and spent most of their time asking him what it meant to be a Toa of Light, as they had been taught there were only 14 elements. He initially thought it was a simple question, yet somehow he had to admit that he couldn't come up with a good answer. Why was he the only one? What had he done to deserve that legendary role? None of it made any sense to him. When they finally approached the oasis, Takanuva was certain that something was wrong. Too many tracks, too few of them looked natural. He soon caught a glimpse of a band of hunched black-armored figures making their way towards the Gamatoran caravan. Skrull, he thought. It had only been days since he had fought their kind last, but still he felt as if he'd fought enough to last a lifetime. Without Tuma or Pterodax to lead them, they were reduced to wandering in small, loose bands like this one, but that did not make them any less fearsome in a fight. The leader of the group was the first to speak, gesturing towards the column of Matoran.
Well, look what we have here.
A little gang of servant machines making their way through the desert. He snorted and looked over Takanuva and his company. This isn't the kind of place to wander, machine. Go back the way you came. This water belongs to us. That's a shame, said Takanuva, charging a bolt of light from one of his staffs. I disagree. These are my people, and I don't intend to let them die on my watch. They've suffered enough. It's your strength against ours, then, servitor. The Skrull gestured to his party of windswept bandits, who punctuated their leader's words with ominous laughter. One of us walks away with their water today, and any warrior worth his weight in sand knows that might makes right in this world. You sound like a Makuta, you know that? And look what happened. His words were cut short as the platoon leader lunged at Takanuva with his battle axe. When he missed, one of his inferiors fired a thorn axe to cover his mistake. It must have been a tactic designed to fight Clitorian, but fighting a Toa of Light was a different matter entirely. A laser blast from Takanuva's staff detonated the thorn axe in midair, knocking the Skrull commander off balance. Then, a blow from one of his staffs knocked the commander to the ground. A warrior with a large warhammer charged at him with a guttural roar. Takanuva ducked out of the way, leaving a holographic double behind. The Skrull took the bait and buried his warhammer in the sands. Takanuva followed up with a laser blast that lopped the warhammer's handle in half. Takanuva looked over at the Gamatoran who had huddled behind a wind-carved boulder. A group of 3 Skrull were advancing on them, thorn-axe launchers at the ready. The Toa of Light leapt into action, throwing one of his staffs at the Skrull in the center and blasting some of the sand between them with his now-freed hand. The sand flew high into the Skrull's faces, cutting off their line of sight. He took the moment to muster up a powerful wave of light and cast it from his hands, knocking them onto their backs. Some of the Gamatoran let out a cheer, but one quickly silenced the rest. Seeing what had happened to their brethren, the rest of the bandits assembled into a tight phalanx, their serrated shields glinting brightly in the midday sun. Takanuva saw their thorn-axe launchers bared in his direction, but he easily redirected the energy of the sunlight into a high-intensity beam, sawing most of their weapons in half. His beam intersected several thorn-axe fruits, slamming the bandits to the ground. The last Skrull standing looked round at his fallen comrades, then made one final charge at Takanuva, sword raised high over his head. The Toa of Light ducked low, thrust a staff into the warrior's legs, and knocked him into the dust. He then strolled up and kicked his weapons aside into the sand. The foot soldier scrambled frantically for his thorn-axe launcher, until he heard the distinctive sound of Takanuva charging another bolt of light, aimed directly at his hands. Try me. Make my day. Monster, spat the Skrull. These lands were supposed to be ours. Takanuva sighed, the glints of the desert sunlight reflecting off of his mask. Monster? Sorry. You lost the right to play the victim the day you started pillaging innocent Matoran. Try again when you keep better friends than these. The Skrull growled, staring Takanuva in the eyes. I was following orders, he muttered, hatred dripping from his lips. And our leader was merely following the law of nature. The weak do not deserve what they cannot defend. Takanuva's eyes narrowed, his staff glowing brighter. Do you actually know the weak? I was one of them once. They're stronger than you think, if you give them a chance and a cause to believe in. You'd be surprised what a simple bamboo disc can do in the right hands. The foot soldier began to speak again, but then smiled grimly as several of his downed comrades began to stand up around him. Most had their armor seared off by laser light or their weapons sawn in half, yet they stood up nonetheless. And the strong? Asked the Skrull, as his compatriots rose around him, bearing their half-melted weapons. What will you do when they have something to believe in? As the armored warriors closed in around him, Takanuva found that he had no good answer to give.
These stories were the first chapters of Mazuka, Legacy Weapons, and Light on the Dunes, A Vision of the Great Being's Prelude, all of which can now be found on the Myths and Legacy website. Stay tuned to Myths and Legacy Twitter for more details. Have an excellent Bionicle Day and have an excellent rest of your year.